Today, Paradox has released a new Tinto Talks Extra, and there are some very big changes coming for proximity and control that I want to talk about. First of all, let's talk about proximity and control. There are 3 big changes that are coming in here. First of all, bailiffs. As it currently stands, bailiffs are a proximity source, which provide around 20 proximity, which translates to 15 control in the location they're built, plus some extra control in the locations surrounding that. That's being changed now. Bailiffs are now going to provide a simple 20% control in the location. In my mind, this is a big buff for bailiffs. They're going to be a lot more powerful because before, a bailiff, or as it is now, a bailiff has no value in a location that already has 15 proximity because it won't increase it beyond that point. It's basically wasted, a useless building in that case. But with these new changes, a bailiff is going to be useful everywhere where control is below 80%, or around 80% exactly, because it is a direct increase to control. This may make bailiffs a little too powerful, I think, because 20% control is a lot. There is no other building in the game that actually offers that amount of control. Even being a core offers 20% control, so now a bailiff is essentially as good as full coring a location. They have mentioned that there is now going to be a limit on how many bailiffs you can have. We don't know what that limit is at the moment though, and I imagine that they themselves are still thinking of it. They have also mentioned that every town and city will allow you to build another bailiff. I'll assume the amount of bailiffs you can create is likely based on your country rank. I imagine counties, duchies, kingdoms, empires will have different amount of bailiffs they can build, with the higher status nations being able to build a lot more. With this change, bailiffs have kind of become a little bit like courthouses in EU4 in the sense that you kind of want to build them anywhere and everywhere because they're just going to increase your control. There's no reason not to build them now. Just being able to increase the amount of income you get from a location by 20% just by building one building is definitely nice. One thing they haven't mentioned here is if bailiffs are going to be able to be built in towns and cities. Currently, bailiffs can only be built in rural locations, but they haven't mentioned if that's changed. I don't know if it is changed or if it's not. If not, bailiffs will still be a little weak because the main places you want to build up your control really is in towns and cities. But if it's been made so bailiffs can be built in towns and cities, they're even going to be even more powerful. If that's the case, you'll be able to build them anywhere and just get 20 control in the location. Very powerful change for bailiffs. The second 2 buildings they've added, or they're going to add, are these mini capitals. There's been a lot of people saying that they want something like this, a building that acts as a second capital and increases proximity and control. So they've added these 2 buildings. Each of them will add 80 proximity in the location, but there are a limited number of them based on your country rank, privileges, reforms, advances, etc. The first is the local governor can be built in cities that has a road connection to the capital, and then a naval governor that can only be built in port cities in the same continent or adjacent subcontinents to the one I assume your capital is in. We can see in the map that has been provided here that capital is up here for Castile, and then we can see the proximity sources down in Sevilla, Toledo, and Cordoba. We can see how proximity and control is actually spreading this a lot. This is very different how the game currently functions. If this was in the current patch, control in these locations would be around 20 because of being full cores, while being a little higher in cities and towns because of the proximity gain from that. So this is really going to change the game and make playing a wide country a lot more viable. Currently, vassals are very strong in EU5 because of how control works. But with these changes, playing a wider country with less vassals is going to be more of an option going forward, especially if we take into account bailiffs on top of this, which are going to be able to increase control in locations by 20%. I'm not sure how I feel about the idea of the naval governor, though. My main complaint about the idea of a naval governor is that it kind of makes maritime presence redundant. If all you need is a city on another landmass or an island, and you can just throw down a naval governor, and it'll increase proximity in the area around it to 80%, then that might be simpler and easier and more cost-effective than having to build up large-scale naval networks of ships to increase proximity via maritime presence. Personally, I don't really like the idea that maritime presence is kind of going to become useless once these naval governors will come online, because the costs of maintaining that large fleet of trade ships will likely be far more expensive than simply building a single naval governor in a city on another landmass. You'll essentially miss out on the 20 proximity that you would normally be able to get if you're able to increase maritime presence to around 100. And even if you do increase maritime presence to 100, you're still going to lose some proximity crossing the various sea zones, even if maritime presence is at 100 in all of them. So as I said, I'm not sure I like the idea of maritime presence just kind of becoming irrelevant. I'm largely fine with the idea of these governorships becoming a thing, as I think vassal play is too strong, and there needs to be some benefit to going wide earlier on to make making vassals less of a obvious choice. I prefer it to be more balanced, where vassals are a good idea, but going wide is also a good idea. You should be able to do both, really, depending on your situation, right? There are some other things I think that are worth mentioning here when it comes to control. That's the estates and the economy. A lot of people have been asking for this. Currently in the game, you lose the money that is not gained through control. It essentially vanishes. With these changes, money is now going to go to the estates directly instead of just disappearing. This is something a lot of people have been asking for obvious reasons, simply because it doesn't make sense for the money in a location to simply vanish just because the government isn't able to tax it. As we can see in this screenshot that's been provided, we can see the amount of wealth in the location. We can then see the tax base based on control and the amount of taxed income, with the rest of the money that isn't being taxed going straight to the estate. We can see in the second screenshot, the burgher's estate here is just making lots and lots of money due to the lack of control in locations. My main concern with this, and I don't hate the idea, is that estates are going to have a lot of money now. They're going to be very, very wealthy, which is going to make estates even more valuable as builders in your country. Because of their massive wealth, they are going to be able to carry out even more extensive building projects than they already were. And estates are very important to buildings, especially burghers, because you can essentially just have them build all the roads in your country yourself without having to build anything, because they love building roads. So I am a little worried that this change is going to make estates a little too powerful in a beneficial way to the player. They have mentioned here that estates' power is now going to be directly impacted by the amount of wealth they have. We'll have to see how that works, because in my mind, it might be perfectly viable to have less control, let the estates have the money, then give them high satisfaction so that they then build valuable buildings across the country. Estates like the burghers, as I mentioned, are very good when it comes to building up your nation, because of how they prioritize roads with the correct privileges. Another big change they've announced is the idea of peasant enfranchisement, which, depending on serfdom or free subjects, control, location, rank, state privileges, and more, the income that would be going to the peasants would instead go to the nobles. This is going to be very important, because the peasants are normally your main source of income in EU5 right now. They pay the most tax compared to all the other estates generally. But if now the money the peasants make is now going to be going to the nobles instead, the nobles are going to become even more powerful and even more of an estate you want to keep on your side and tax, whereas peasants are going to become less important. Keeping peasants happy is going to become less important if they don't have the money to pay a lot of tax. We can see here in the screenshots they've showed us of how the enfranchisement will look. This is Hungary, a country with low enfranchisement and strong nobility. And then we see Sweden here with high peasant enfranchisement and a weaker nobility. I'm not sure how I feel about this change, because I feel like the nobles are already the strongest estate in nearly every country at the start of the game. And normally you kind of want to weaken them already, right? So this change is going to kind of encourage you to weaken them even more than you might already be doing, or to go all in on supporting them. It might even reach a state where you kind of ignore the peasants and how upset they are about various things, because they simply just don't have the wealth to really pay a lot of tax, and instead prioritize increasing the satisfaction of the nobles, which might be an interesting system. It might be interesting to play around with the idea that you either choose between nobles or peasants, because strengthening one weakens the other and therefore weakens the amount of tax they pay. I'm curious to see how it all works, but I'm a little worried on the balance. It's a fine line to make it so that both going pro-noble and pro-peasant will be viable, and one just won't be flat out better than the other. So we'll see. We'll have to see how this works. There's a few other things they've announced in this update, like food is going to now decay, which honestly I think is fine. It's also going to be a bit of an indirect debuff to levies, since raised levies decrease the food production in a location, and as there is now food decay, starvation may become a bigger issue. I think this is a good idea, because raising levies currently is too powerful. There's no reason not to raise them, really. But if starvation starts to become a problem because you've raised your levies for too long, that could be a good way to encourage a transition to standing armies. The main problem will be making the AI do this, because if you've played to the end of the game, you'll find the AI doesn't really make a transition to standing armies. They'll be using levies from the start of the game to the end. So I think anything that can be done to dissuade them from using levies and make that transition to standing armies is a good thing. They've also talked about the idea of changing up how good production works based on the supply of the good in the market where the buildings that use that good are located. I'm not sure how this is going to work. We'll just have to see if it even matters or whether it's just largely irrelevant change. We'll just have to see how it goes. My overall thoughts on a lot of these changes are positive. I really like the idea that now estates are kind of going to be in conflict with the government over the income, where estates kind of want to keep control low. We'll have to see whether the AI for the estates is good enough to do this. They've mentioned that there's going to be new buildings that actively decrease control in locations. So we'll have to see whether they can nail the balance between the AI estates trying to drag down control in the nation while you, the player, try and increase it. Because as it currently stands, if you increase satisfaction enough for an estate, they will no longer build negative buildings like toll castles or the peasant villages that the commoners make. I do worry that this will encourage estate maxing even further by encouraging you just to increase happiness of the estates to their max and just them build up your whole country for free, essentially. We'll have to see how it works in practice. When it comes to the control and proximity changes, I think bailiffs might be a tad too strong now. As I mentioned, they're basically the equivalent of a core. I think the amount of control they increase could be brought down to maybe 15% or 10%, but we'll have to see how the limit works. If they're very limited in how many you can make, I think 20% would be fine, because if it's just only a couple you can make, getting 20% in a few locations is fine. If you can make a lot of them, I think that they should be either be reducing the amount you can make or debuff them a little to avoid a situation like with courthouses where you just want to make all of them everywhere you can, really. As I mentioned, I don't really like the idea of naval governors because I feel like they conflict and kind of make redundant the idea of maritime presence. But again, we'll have to see how that works. I do think the mini capitals giving 80% proximity might be a tad too high. I was thinking somewhere around 70% or 60%. But again, we'll have to see. I imagine these numbers probably aren't final. They're almost definitely not final. I'll be surprised if they are. So I imagine there's some tweaking. There's going to be some tweaking involved. For now, though, I think I've said everything I wanted to say and covered everything I wanted to talk about. So we'll leave the video here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.